All right, so in the next presentation, we talked a lot about the cosmos and the galaxy and solar system in the last one. So now I want to bring it down to home and show you guys some of the finely tuned processes that exist here on Earth. But before we do, before I get into the meat of it, just sort of talk about some really interesting sciencey stuff that's compatible with Christianity. So you all probably remember the scientific method from school. These steps, sometimes they vary a little depending on, the textbook you're looking at or the teacher that's teaching you. But this is really the foundation for scientific inquiry. Well, what's fascinating to me that I didn't know before is that the scientific method, it was developed by Francis Bacon. He was an English philosopher. And he actually took the biblical interpretation method and spun it so that it could fit scientific inquiry. And so the scientific method, which is sort of the foundation by which all science is performed, has its foundation in the Bible, which I didn't know before, and I thought that was really fascinating. And it illustrates how Christian theology has played a crucial role in the development of not only the scientific method, but the discoveries made by Western science because of it. And that was Dr. Ross again that said that quote. And so what does the Bible say about testing? In 1 Thessalonians, we see, test everything, hold on to the good. Or do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. And that's in Romans. And then in James, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And so it's fascinating how we can see that foundation for the scientific method kind of getting pulled out of the Bible. Did anybody else know that, or is it just me that wasn't aware of that? Maybe lifelong Christians kind of already knew that stuff, but it's fascinating to me. And that's another thing you're not going to hear in school, like, hey, Francis Bacon developed the scientific method and it came from the Bible. Fortunately, we're not going to hear that. All right, so like I did last time, I went over some scientists that are very influential, that were Christians. And so we're going to come back a little bit closer to our time and look at a few more. And so the first guy, Gregor Mendel, you guys probably remember him from your biology class. If you pick up any, Biology 101 textbook, you're going to see him in here. He did a lot of genetic studies on pea plants, studying recessive and dominant genes. But he was a Roman Catholic Augustinian abbot. He was also a meteorologist, a biologist, and he's considered the founder of modern genetics. And at the time, it's kind of sad, he didn't get a whole lot of credit for his work, but posthumously he was recognized for his many contributions to modern biology. But he was a Christian first and foremost. I love George Washington Carver. I didn't know a whole lot about him until sort of doing my own research, but he rose out of slavery. He was a Bible class leader. He was also an agricultural scientist in the South. And so you can imagine trying to be an influential scientist as a black man in the South during these time frames was not an easy task, but he rose above it and he really became very influential. And in fact, if any of you garden, you know the importance of crop rotation and planting nitrogen fixing plants. That came from George Carver's discoveries. And so he really turned things around in the South. He really helped farmers be able to better manage their fields and better manage their crops. And he was also, I think it's important to note, he was the first black man to earn a Bachelor of Science degree. And he actually introduced science to the Tuskegee Institute. So just an amazing guy, just influential on so many levels. But first and foremost, he was a Christian. And he said, my faith in Jesus is the mechanism through which I carry out my scientific work. It's pretty profound. Okay, Arthur Compton. Some of you may not have heard of him. Honestly, I hadn't either until I started doing this research, but very influential. He was a deacon and then later an elder at his church in St. Louis. He was a physicist, and he discovered the wave and particle properties of light. He discovered that light travels in a wave, and it's composed of particles like protons. And he actually won the Nobel Prize in 1927 for that discovery. But first and foremost, he was a Christian. He said, science can have no quarrel with a religion which postulates a God to whom men are his children. And he also says, for myself, faith begins with a realization that a supreme intelligence brought the universe into being and created man. It's not difficult for me to have this faith, for it is incontrovertible that where there is a plan, there is intelligence. An orderly, unfolding universe testifies to the truth of the most majestic statement ever uttered. In the beginning, God. And so here again, we can see some more scientists that are incredibly influential that have since passed away but are still influencing the world around us today. But first and foremost, they were Christians, and God came before their science. And what I find the most beautiful about this is they give God the credit for the work that they're doing. All right, so in Isaiah 45, we see, for thus says the Lord who created the heavens, he is God who formed the earth and made it. He established it, he did not create it empty. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord and there is no other. And so I too believe that this earth was formed for the sole purpose of us inhabiting it. And I love that the Bible, it confirms that. All right, so now we're going to get into some fine-tuning. Again, I'm going to kind of be getting into the weeds a little bit, and I promise it's not to bore you all to death. I really, really want to show you how all these different elements work together for us to be here. And so the first one is axial tilt, which is also called obliquity, if you ever hear that term. And basically, it's our tilt, which is currently at 23.5 degrees, and science believes that it does vary between 21.5 to 24.5 degrees. But our tilt is what allows us to have our seasons. And you can imagine how extreme certain places on Earth would be if we didn't sort of have that break as it goes around the sun. And so our tilt is vital. Again, it gives us our seasons. If it were any greater or lesser, as I said, our surface temperatures would be so extreme that it's unlikely that life, much less intelligent life, could exist. All right, and if that rate of axial change, this change is happening over thousands of years. If that change were too quick, again, climactic changes would be far too extreme for life to exist. So even our little tilt of our planet is at the just right degree. Now, what I find interesting in Job, I don't necessarily think that this is referring specifically to axial tilt. But in Job, it says, he stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. I find that interesting because really astronomy and, a lot of the science really wasn't going on at the time Job was written, right? So for the author of Job to write that the earth doesn't hang on anything, perhaps to an atheist that would seem like, oh, who cares? Everybody knows that. But considering the time that Job was written, there weren't telescopes, there weren't a lot of advanced scientific discoveries. To me, that's really profound, that the Bible acknowledged first that the earth is sort of a free floating form, for lack of a better word. So I thought that was interesting. All right, another fine-tuning is albedo, and that just refers to the ratio of light that's reflected back out versus what's absorbed on the surface. And so if it were greater or less, so if it were greater, that means more of the sun's energy is being absorbed by the Earth. So you can imagine we would heat up pretty quickly. I'm sorry, did I say that backwards? Can I say that again? If albedo was greater, meaning more was reflected out, then we would be too cold. We'd have runaway glaciation events. If it were less, where the Earth was absorbing more of that sunlight, then we would heat up and we'd have runaway greenhouse effect. And so the amount of sunlight that we reflect versus absorb has to be just right. Okay, the thickness of the crust. Believe it or not, the thickness of our crust determines whether or not life can exist on our planet. And so it's estimated that our crust ranges anywhere between 9 miles to 12 miles thick, depending upon where you're standing. But if it were much thicker, we would have too much oxygen that would be transferred from the atmosphere down into the crust. Obviously, we need the just right amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. If it were thicker, volcanic and tectonic activity necessary for continental buildup would be too weak. So you could imagine that if it were thicker, perhaps Mount Everest would only be 10,000 feet versus 35,000-ish feet. All right, if it were thinner, then volcanic and tectonic activity would be far too great. So you can imagine a planet where there's too much volcanic activity. It's unlikely that anything would survive on that. And so speaking of volcanic activity, that too is a fine-tuning parameter. And so we tend to think of volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, wildfires as being very devastating events. And they can be, but they do serve a purpose for the planet. And so volcanic activity, it increases our land masses, it enriches the soil, it provides geothermal energy for us, and it adds water to the atmosphere. If the frequency of volcanic eruptions were less, then we would have insufficient amounts of carbon dioxide and water returning back to the atmosphere for our benefit. And obviously, if it were a much higher frequency, again, life, certainly advanced life, would be completely devastated. So the frequency of our volcanic eruptions has to be just right for us to exist. Same with forest fires. Again, we tend to think of these as just being destructive and sort of evil and negative, and they can be traumatic and horrible for folks, but they do serve a purpose. Now, forest fires is a little tricky. Because I do think that human beings have to be responsible and manage their forests. So I'm not saying that we should take a hands-off approach because all forest fires are good. That's certainly not what I mean. But when they're managed properly, because we're impacting them, then forest fires as a whole are not a bad thing. All right, so they reduce competition for mature trees. They clear out a lot of underbrush in the forest, which makes the forest healthier. They nourish the soil, again, which makes it healthier. And then some species are fire dependent, such as the lodgepole pine. It actually needs fire to release its seeds, which is really fascinating. And so you could see the nourishing of the soil, the clearing of the underbrush. It's making it's rejuvenating the forest, which allows other biodiversity to exist. So what if forest fires were more or less frequent? If they were smaller or less frequent, we'd have a lot of growth inhibitors in the soil, so plants would not grow. Perhaps the decomposers, like the insects, would not exist. Soil nitrification would be insufficient. That's where we convert ammonia into nitrogen, which is good for plants. And then there'd be an inadequate coverage of the planet by savannas and grasslands. And so we do want to have some of those cleared out areas without forests, because we have a whole separate ecosystem that exists in the savannas and grasslands. And so you can probably assume or see that if forest fires were greater, too many species would be destroyed, potentially extinction events, and then too many forests would be converted to those grasslands. And so while we would gain the biodiversity in the grasslands and savannas, we'd lose it in the forests. And so in order for us to have just this perfect amount of forests and rainforests and grasslands and tundras, all of this is finely tuned. All right, and so I thought it was interesting, we tend to think of these processes as being just horrific, but I think as Christians, we can trust that God's in control of this stuff, and he knows what he's doing. And in the Bible, we see some references to that. In Romans, we have, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, those who are called according to his purpose. And in Job, he covers his hands with the lightning and commands it to strike the mark. And so I think it just goes to show that God's in control of all of this. Okay, so I said we were going to talk about Earth's processes, but I'm going to kind of step back out into the solar system for a second and talk about the sun's luminosity, or its brightness. Okay, so our sun, it fuses hydrogen and helium. That's how we get our energy. As it ages, its core density increases. That causes the sun to burn brighter. Now, scientists estimate, this is science speaking here, they estimate that the sun's luminosity has increased 12% since its formation. Now, well, let me keep going here. And they also say a solar change of just 2% would make the Earth uninhabitable. And so if we're saying on one hand that it's increasing, that it has increased 12% and it's currently increasing, but yet just a 2% change would cause life to not exist, what's keeping that in check? So remember that question for a second, because we're coming back to Earth here. All right, so the carbon cycle. There's actually 2 layers of the carbon cycle, and basically the carbon cycle is just moving carbon throughout the Earth. It's moving it from the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, which is our water bodies, down into the crust and even into the mantle. So it's just cycling all around. It keeps Earth from overheating, but it also keeps it from overcooling as well. And it makes long life on Earth possible because carbon is absolutely a fundamental element. Without it, life simply cannot exist. We are all carbon-based life forms. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's 2 depths to the carbon cycle. The first one is the shallow, which is basically up top above the crust. And most of you probably are already familiar with this. It's been very well understood for at least the last decade, and it's simply moving carbon from the air, through the water, and through the crust. And it happens through photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and silicate erosion. So that's the really kind of easy one to grasp. But then there's the deep carbon cycle, and this is where it gets pretty interesting, in my nerdy opinion, I guess. But this is a fairly new discovery. We actually haven't known about this kind of in-depth process for very long. But this is where carbon actually moves through the mantle. So if you remember from geology class, you've got the crust that we all sit on, and just below that is the molten mantle. So we're actually talking about driving carbon down into that mantle. And that happens through subduction. And so if you can imagine the Pacific plate, the North American plate, well, for you guys it would be this way, right? But bear with me. The Pacific plate is diving under the North American plate. And that's what we get the Ring of Fire from. And so that is subduction, when one plate is diving under another one. And so as you can imagine, all of that crust being pushed down into the mantle, it's sending a lot of carbon down in there. And so the volcanoes end up returning a lot of that carbon back to the atmosphere. The volcanoes also return the water back to the atmosphere. But this whole process between the shallow and the deep carbon cycle is highly fine-tuned. And I'm not going to go into all of these subcomponents and parameters because it's just too much. But what they mean by the subcomponents, they're saying that there's 23 elements or parts to this process. So one would be the mantle. Another would be the rate of subduction. So those are two elements in this process. So there's 23 of those. Now there's 37 parameters that those components have to abide by. So in other words, if the mantle is a component of the process, the viscosity of the mantle would be a parameter. So its viscosity is highly fine-tuned. If subduction is a component, then perhaps the rate of that or speed of that subduction would be a parameter. It has to be just right. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. It's basically just saying you have all these parts moving in this process, and every part has to be finely tuned in order to work together for us to have this carbon cycle, which is necessary for life. So I hope that makes sense. So I asked you guys to remember the question, what compensates for our sun's increasing luminosity as it ages? Well, the shallow and the deep cycles are highly fine-tuned, and they perfectly compensate for the sun's increasing luminosity. And so you can see that we have sort of this greenhouse effect that we tend to think of as a bad thing. You hear the term greenhouse effect and you immediately think oceans are rising, we're all going to be dead in 6 years, or whatever the number is. But some degree of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere are necessary for life. And so those greenhouse gases actually help compensate for the sun's increasing luminosity, which is pretty amazing. Now, I just want to touch on something really quick because quite a few people asked during Ladies' Day about climate change. And some asked if this carbon cycle would also compensate for climate change. And unfortunately, I can't answer that. There's really, if you think about how long the study of climate change has been around, it hasn't really been that long. And so the scientific evidence, in my opinion, is sort of out currently on it. I think we've got extremes, right? You have people that think that cows are going to destroy the planet, but then you have folks over here that think, humans aren't doing anything. I think we're kind of somewhere in the middle. I think Earth undergoes cycles and changes, but I do think that human beings can be irresponsible in certain respects. And so the data there isn't enough of it to conclusively say that we'll be fine because the carbon cycle will help kind of compensate. I don't know. I don't know that. But what is interesting, I did do some research, and I actually found that this was Dr. Hugh Ross again. He found that some of our things that we do not only contribute to heating of the planet, but some actually contribute to cooling as well. And so that's something that we don't necessarily hear about. So I'd be curious as we kind of go on later and later to see what the science says. Is that heating and cooling enough to balance one another out? I don't know. But that's interesting to me, that it's not just all about heating of the planet. All right, so just kind of skim through this kind of quickly. So another cycle on Earth that's obviously necessary is our water cycle. And this is the water cycle, the surface water cycle. Again, this is probably very familiar to all of you. This is simply the process of moving Earth's water throughout the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. And you can see that happens through evaporation, condensation, precipitation, surface runoff, and there's some others in there too. But you guys get the idea. But what I find interesting about the surface water cycle from a biblical perspective is that we didn't have an understanding of this cycle until the 17th century. But if you look at the Bible, so here in Job, it says, "For he draws up the drops of water. They distill his mist and rain, which the skies pour down and drop on mankind abundantly." Sounds a whole lot like evaporation and precipitation. And then in Psalm, it is who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, who makes lightnings for the rain and brings forth the wind from his storehouse. Again, now we have condensation with cloud formation, precipitation. And then lastly in Job, he binds up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not split open under them. So again, we've got evaporation and condensation. When was Job written? It's the oldest book, right? So the fact that we didn't have an understanding from a science perspective until the 17th century, it's all in the Bible. So that to me is mind-blowing. I just love how the more I learn about science and the Bible, coming across these little passages, and it's almost like little puzzle pieces fitting together for me. And I don't know, maybe I'm just a nerd, but it's pretty exciting to me. All right, so we talked about the shallow water cycle. There is a deep water cycle too. And it's similar to the carbon cycle in that it's cycling everything on down through the mantle. And it's also highly fine-tuned. And it's really what gives us a just right balance of plate tectonic activity. And we've already sort of touched on this, that you can imagine if we had too many or not enough volcanic eruptions, what would the consequences be? But we have to have those just right numbers in order to have advanced civilizations, in order to compensate for land erosion. And it also produces all of the necessary minerals that we need to exist. And so that deep water cycle is just another highly fine-tuned element on Earth. Scientists also believe that it works with the carbon cycle to help compensate for the sun's luminosity as well. So a lot of moving pieces here. All right. So we're going to kind of switch gears and go from more of the geology stuff into more of the ecology, zoology. And so we can see here in Genesis that immediately, right off the bat, from the very beginning, we've got lots of biological diversity. Let the earth spout vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on earth. Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kind. And so again, from the very beginning, God created this wonderful biological diversity. Okay, so we're going to kind of get into ecology a little bit here. And really the point I want to try and make with this is that, we talked about all these fine-tuning processes happening in geology and cosmology, but what's fascinating is, to me, even at an ecological level, it all works like a finely tuned machine. And so with regards to ecology, all organisms are classified, and they're called trophic levels. So at the very top there, you can see those would be the apex predators. Those are going to be the animals that are seldom predated upon by anything else. So that would be your grizzly bears, your gray wolves, human beings, of course, your bald eagles, red-tailed hawks. Those are the guys at the very top that are doing a whole lot of killing. And then as we go down, kind of in the middle there, we have the carnivores and herbivores. Carnivores and omnivores kind of in the middle. And then at the bottom, we have our producers, and those are our plants. And then our decomposers, which is our bugs, they're down there too. But you look at this and you might not realize that this is all about balance. Ecosystems are finely balanced. And they all work together All of these levels work together to kind of have that harmonious ecosystem. And so here's sort of a really quick snapshot of a healthy ecosystem. This is in Yellowstone, and you can see we've got elk and antelope and bison and beavers and harlequin ducks and wolves and ravens, plus all the plants that are in these photos as well. And you can see how all of these are working together to ensure a finely running ecosystem. The interesting thing is that there are some species that have a disproportionate influence on their ecosystem, and they're referred to as keystone species. And so wolves are an excellent example of a keystone species. And so again, a keystone species is a species in which all the others in the ecosystem depend upon. Maybe not directly, but indirectly as well. And so removal of this keystone species can have a devastating impact on the ecosystem. And so some other ones are sea otters, tigers, bees, and mangrove trees. So even plants can be a keystone species. And so when you pull these species out of the ecosystem, generally what we see is what's called a trophic cascade. Things start falling apart. And one of the most well-known, it's actually still being researched because we're recovering from it, but one of the most well-known examples of trophic cascade and an ecosystem falling apart is when human beings removed, in their infinite wisdom, removed gray wolves from Yellowstone National Park in the 1920s and 1930s. And so I don't expect you to be able to read the words on here, but I do like this picture. I think it's a really good illustration. So what happened in the 20s and 30s, we had a lot of cattle coming in. And so, of course, the wolves were predating the cattle. And so humans thought, let's get rid of the wolves. And so we got rid of all wolves in Yellowstone National Park. Well, when we removed the wolves, the elk population exploded. When the elk population exploded, they ate all the aspens and willows. Now the beavers had nothing to eat. The beavers left. When the beavers left, the dams eroded and fell away. Now you no longer have ponds and lakes. Without ponds and lakes, your fish, your amphibians, and your waterfowl disappeared. And then going over to the coyote, the gray wolf will predate on coyote. And so when the gray wolves were killed off, the coyote populations exploded. And easy prey for coyote are the voles and the foxes, and even the antelope. So those disappeared. And then over on the right, we have ravens, eagles, and bears. They're scavengers. And so when wolves make a kill of like an elk, they eat what they want and leave, and the remaining elk carcass feeds the ravens, the bears, and the eagles. Well, once the wolves were gone, their numbers dwindled too. And so this is a perfect textbook example of trophic cascade. When we interfere with God's perfectly balanced ecosystem, it falls apart. The nice thing, though, is in the mid-90s, we finally realized the error of our ways and started introducing the gray wolves back. Well, they came back, the elk numbers went down, the aspens and willows grew back, the beavers came back, they built their dams and created ponds, your waterfowl came back. And so all of these things came back into place. And basically, we're still recovering from that, but really, we're getting closer to having that perfect, pristine ecosystem that we once had. And to me, it's like a fine-tuned machine. You pull one component out, and perhaps maybe it'll just run really bad, but won't completely fall apart. Or in the case of the wolves, you pull that component out, and it really does kind of all fall apart. And I do want to give credit to Oregon State University for this illustration. I think it's a really good one. Okay, so we're getting into some slides that I did not have for Ladies' Day. I know I had a request for more sort of ecology animal stuff, which I was happy to do because this is right up my alley. So what I want to talk about now is what's called convergence. And so it refers to the occurrence of identical or nearly identical anatomical, physiological, or genetic features in species that are not related to one another. So one of the greatest examples of convergence is the chameleon and the sand lance fish. So if you can see here, you know how chameleons, they have the independently moving eyes? Well, the sand lance fish has the same identical eye structure. What's more is their tongues that come out to grab insects, the fish also has the same structure. And so I'm going to talk about why that sort of contradicts what evolutionists tell us. So here you have two completely unrelated species that live in completely unrelated environment. They're facing totally different pressures, predatory pressures or competition pressures, but yet they've developed through random accidental processes identical structures. Another example, bats and toothed whales. This is a fruit bat. I'm gonna embarrass my husband. I think they are so cute. Fruit bats. Are they not? Anyway.
No.
It's adorable. Anyway, so you guys know that fruit bats and whales use echolocation. And so here again you have two completely different species, although they're both mammals, two completely different species that have evolved over time through a series of accidental processes to develop this really sophisticated ability of echolocation. I think that's fascinating. Still another example. Here we have an African gray parrot and a raven. The ravens are members of the corvid family of birds, and they're known for being really smart. Eric is sick of hearing this, by the way. He hears this all the time. They're really, really smart birds. And then at the top, obviously, we have a chimp. Well, what's fascinating is these are all very different species, but yet their brain structure is almost identical. And that's what allows the corvids to do problem solving. I think I mentioned at Ladies' Day, there's a video out there of, I believe it's a raven. He's got this flask where there's a treat at the bottom, and he's got to get that treat. Well, he can't fit his head in, and so the researchers give him just a straight piece of metal. And that raven figures out how to bend a hook in that metal and fish out his little treat. If you get a chance, watch it. There's also other ones where they figure out if they drop in enough rocks, the treat will float to the bottom and they'll be able to, I mean, it's amazing. So highly intelligent birds. And then of course the gray parrot, I think, holds the record for the animal that can speak the most, that can actually speak the most words outside of humans. Shares the same brain structure with chimps. And so again, that's an example of convergence. And then the last one. We have an octopus at the bottom and obviously a human at the top there. But what's fascinating is cephalopods, so your squid, your octopus, they have the same eye structure as humans. And not just humans, but really most vertebrates, animals with a spine. And so you can see on the left there, the really close similarity between the eye structures. Obviously, octopus are living in an environment far different than what we're living in and face completely different pressures. And so it's really fascinating to see how these really different species have identical structures in them. So what does that mean as, from an evolutionary standpoint? Well, evolutionists will claim that convergence comes about by similar environmental pressures. Okay, well, I don't agree, but that's what they say. They also say that this happens because natural selection channels randomly occurring variations in unrelated species towards an identical outcome. So here you have these randomly occurring variations and mutations. They just happen to go to the same identical outcome. All right, well. Now, naturalistic models would suggest that convergence then should be incredibly rare. If what the evolutionists are saying is true, we really shouldn't expect to see convergence at all. Because the reason for this is that the mechanism that drives evolution consists of many unpredictable chance events, one after another. So again, if you believe all of that, then you would expect to see very little convergence happening in nature. But we do. There are hundreds of examples of convergence happening throughout nature. And so, in my opinion, it contradicts itself with those statements. On one hand, says it's rare, but yet clearly we can see plenty of examples. So that's convergence. Now we'll get into mutualism and coevolution. And we're getting sort of to the end of the slides. So everybody's probably heard of symbiotic relationships in which one species benefits the other. And it can be 2 species or it can be 3 species. And there's all different types of symbiotic relationships. You have parasitic relationships, mutualistic relationships, and we're going to just kind of focus on not just mutualistic relationships, but obligate ones. And we'll get into that in a second. So mutualism can involve all sorts of processes. It could be for defense, it can be for cleaning, seed dispersal, or even pollination. And so these pictures here at the top, we have the red-billed ox picker. This little guy will eat like 100 ticks a day, so really working hard. And here you can see he is eating the ticks off of an impala. And then at the bottom, the bird at the bottom is called a Clark's nutcracker. These birds actually have a little pouch in their mouth to where they can collect these seeds and then fly far away. And as they do that, they end up dropping some seeds out. So it benefits them because they get a good meal, and it benefits the pine because by spreading the seeds farther away, you're ensuring genetic diversity of the species. And so both of these are example of mutualistic relationships. They're benefiting from each other. Now, some mutualistic relationships take it a step farther to where they absolutely need one another in order to survive. And those are referred to as obligate, and we're going to get into that next. But when we think about mutualism and really symbiotic relationships in general, we're getting into the territory of coevolution. And so evolutionists would say that perhaps the red-billed ox picker and the impala, they simply, as they came up through the evolutionary chain, they underwent random mutations and variations at a similar pace and met at a singular point in time to be able to benefit from one another. To me, that's similar to convergence in that these beneficial mutations should be incredibly rare, and so we really shouldn't expect to see much mutualism or symbiosis, but we do. And to me, it's even more profound when we look at obligate mutualism. Again, this is where both species depend on one another. Now, I'm chuckling because if you were late, I think I destroyed everybody who loves figs. I apologize. That was not my intention to ruin it for. I was going to bring fig Newtons as a snack, but I didn't. But this is really, really fascinating. The fig absolutely needs the fig wasp, and the fig wasp absolutely needs the fig. Now, I will say, and I didn't say this at Ladies' Day, and I feel like I should have, these little fig wasps are tiny. So when I say these guys die and then you end up eating them, I'm not talking about like a big old yellow jacket or like a bald-faced hornet. These are little itty-bitty guys. So I don't know if that helps. It probably doesn't, but I'm trying. I'm trying to redeem the fig here. So what's really interesting about this is that a fig is almost like an inside-out flower. And so all of those little sort of spots that you see, each one of those is an individual flower. And so when it flowers, it releases a very pleasant smell to the wasp. The female wasp, she'll find a hole in the fig and she'll burrow her way into it. In the process, she ends up ripping her wings off and stuff, but it doesn't matter because she's not coming out. She's going to die in there. So she goes into the fig, and she already has pollen on her from the fig that she emerged from when she was born. So she's going into this new fig, spreading around the other fig's pollen. She's now pollinated the fig tree, and then she lays her eggs. Now, when the larvae emerge and they start feeding on some seeds, the female wasp does die in the fig. The other females that have just hatched, they'll climb out and they'll go do their thing and they'll start the process all over again. Well, the males, when they're born, they will emerge and they will fertilize all of the eggs that that female had laid in there. And so then you have the process start all over again. And then the males die in the fig too, so. But they say, the fig just sort of absorbs them, and there's really not much left. So the crunchy stuff you're eating, it's not a wasp. It's actually the seeds, so it's okay. It's not working, is it? Yes, yeah, so I just cover that one up. But it's fascinating that these two completely different species need one another to survive. And in fact, I read a story a while ago, and I don't remember all the details, but we brought figs over, I think, to California, fig trees. And we couldn't, for the life of us, figure out why are these fig trees not producing any fruit? Well, we failed to bring the wasp over with it. So it's pretty interesting.
How did they get them here?
That's a good question. I don't know. Just bottled them up and brought them all over. That's a good question. Another example of an obligate mutualistic relationship in which both species depend upon each other is one that we can see in our own backyards. In fact, I was just talking about this with the boys like a month ago when our peonies were blooming. But if you have a peony plant and you look at its little bud, you'll probably see a whole bunch of ants running around on it. Well, the ants are feeding on some of the nectar and food from the peony, but then they're also eating some of the bad insects that destroy the plant. And so both of these species depend upon one another to exist. So it's pretty cool. This is one we can actually see here in the Northwest, Right, and then of course we all know that bumblebees and honeybees, they also form an obligate relationship with flowers. And so the bees need the pollen and the nectar for food, and then of course the flowers need the bees for pollination. And so, if you're an evolutionist, like I said, you believe that these two very different species through random accidental processes evolved up together to be able to exist with one another. And evolutionists tell us that evolution in and of itself is a very rare occurrence. But yet we see these relationships that are highly complex, we see them everywhere. All right. Okay. So wrapping up, we went over some of the parameters of the fine-tuning of the universe and of the planet. Like I said, there are hundreds and hundreds more. And here's just a sample of just the different parameters. For example, the velocity of light has to be just right in order for advanced life to exist. Solar winds have to be just right. Let's see, the diversity of animal parasite species has to be just right. Believe it or not, we want some parasites, but we don't want too many. And so Dr. Ross, he has calculated that if you factor in all of these parameters, he says, there's less than one chance in 10 to the 1,032nd power exists that even one such life support body would occur anywhere in the universe without invoking divine miracles. Now, it's interesting because we had a conversation with an atheist recently, and we were talking about these huge probability numbers. And his response is, so you're saying we have a chance? Okay. Which is funny. If we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning of my first presentation, they'll also say things like, there's an infinite number of stars in the universe. Well, no, there really isn't. So they'll say that, but then when I actually present a probability, it's, well, you're saying I have a chance. Well, sure. Those aren't great odds, but okay. But I mean, this number, that's a 1 with 1,032 zeros behind it. It's huge. You can't even wrap your brain around that. And so what Dr. Ross is saying is if that number changed by just 1 digit, life would not exist. And so that's why I believe that we are not going to find life elsewhere. I don't think life is coming here. I think we're it. That's my opinion anyway. All right, so to close this one out, I just wanted to read from Psalm. You have given him domain over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And so I do firmly believe that God created this amazing planet and all of its biological diversity for us.